In this video, we're going to be talking about percents, fractions, and decimals. We've already talked about fractions and decimals in our previous units, so now we're going to add percents to that list of ratios. So our essential questions are, what is a percent? How do you convert between decimals and percents? And how do you convert between fractions and percents? So first of all, what is a percent? A percent is a rate per 100. Percents always make a comparison to 100. So a percent is a ratio or a fraction that is always making a comparison to 100. So if you think of the word percent and cut it into two parts, per cent. Now, per, we've used that word before when we talked about rates and unit rates. So like 50 miles per hour, or $17 per hour, or $1.50 per pound. So the word per means out of, or for every, and then the word cent means 100. If you think of the word century, there's 100 years in a century. If you think of cents in a dollar, there are 100 cents in a dollar, or centimeter, there are 100 centimeters in a meter. So the word percent literally means out of 100. So a percent is always making a comparison to 100. So if you see something like 50%, this percent symbol means out of 100. So 50% means 50 out of 100. So that's like a fraction or a ratio, which is a ratio of 50 out of 100. So a percent is always another form of a ratio or a fraction, but it's always out of 100. So how do you convert between decimals and percents? 0% means 0 out of 100, which is 0, and 100% is 100 out of 100, which is 1 whole. So decimal values between 0 and 1 can be written as a percent between 0% and 100%. So if you want to visualize that, I've got a kind of a double number line here, and I've divided it from 0 to 1 whole on the bottom, and from 0% to 100% on the top. So you can see when we divide each of these equally, we can see that there's a connection between the decimal value and the percent. So 1/10 is 10%, 2/10 is 20%, 3/10 is 30%, and so on. So how do you convert these decimals to percent? So if you have a decimal value, how do you write that as a percent? So right here we see, to write a decimal as a percent, we simply have to multiply the decimal value by 100. So a couple examples here. If I have 5/10, which is right here on the number line, and I want to convert that to the percentage, I just multiply that by 100. 5/10 times 100 is 50. So 5/10, the decimal value, is a percent of 50%. So 5/10 is 50%. If I have a decimal value like 743 thousandths, or 0.743, that's going to be somewhere in here on my number line. And so it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 80% when I convert it. So when I multiply that by 100, I get 74.3. So 0.743 is 74.3%. So very easy to convert a decimal to a percent. You just multiply it by 100. So let's take a look at some of these examples here. Let's start with 0.4. Now, something that 7th graders like to do is they just see a 4 here, so they'll automatically call that 4%. But that's not true. You have to be very careful with that, because there's kind of a hidden 0 behind there when we're talking about hundredths, because our percents are always out of 100. So if you look on the number line, here's 0.4. You'll see that it is not 4%, but 40%. And we'll see that if you take 0.4 times 100, you get 40. So 0.4 is 40%. 0.12, if we take that times 100, that's going to convert to 12%. So 0.12 would be right about here, and that makes sense. That's about where 12% would be as well. 0.965, that's going to be somewhere over here on my number line. So I would expect that to be somewhere between 90 and 100%. So if I take that times 100, you get 96.5%. And then 0.16, that's going to be somewhere right here on the number line. So that's going to be between 10 and 20%. So if I take 0.16 times 100, I get 16%, and that makes sense. 0.8345, that's going to be somewhere here on the number line. So that's going to be between 80 and 90%. So if I take that times 100, I get 83.45%. percent. And don't forget to put that percent symbol on there once you convert it. Now, a lot of 7th graders think, well, it's still a decimal value, so is it still a decimal? Well, you can have decimal values that represent a percent. So that's 83.45 out of 100. So it's important to put that percent symbol on there to indicate that it is a percent still and not a decimal representation of the ratio. And then lastly, 0.75 is going to be right here, halfway between 0.7 and 0.8. So I would expect that to be between 70 and 80%. If I take that times 100, I get 75%, and that's what I get. So converting decimal values to percents, simply multiplying by 100. So then how do I write a percent back as a decimal? So how do I convert backwards? Well, if I multiplied by 100 to get the decimal to a percent, I should just do the opposite of that to get the percent to a decimal. Well, I'm going to divide by 100. So to write a percent as a decimal, we're going to divide the percent value by 100. So again, if I have 50% and I want to convert that back to a decimal representation, I'm going to divide it by 100 and I get 0.5. So 50% is equal to 0.5. And then my 74.3%, which is right here, if I want to convert that back to its decimal value, I divide by 100. So 74.3% is 0.743. Let's convert these percents to decimal values. 74%, if I divide that by 100, I get 0.74. 12.5%, if I divide that by 100, I get 0.125. And then here's another one to be careful of. A lot of students will take 3% and just write it as 0.3, which it's not. If we divide that by 100, you get 0.03. So that 0 in there is very important because that's 3%. And if it was 0.3, that'd be 30%. So there's a difference there between those two. 1.5%, if I divide that by 100, I get 0.015. 99.99%, if I divide that by 100, I get 0.9999. 34.54%, if I divide that by 100, I get 0.3454 as a decimal. So again, converting percents back to decimal values, pretty easy to do, just dividing by 100. So now how do I convert between fractions and percents? So again, I've got a double number line here that's got fraction values from 0 to 1 and their equivalent percents above them. So this is a little bit more involved, but still not that difficult. So to write a percent as a fraction, we're going to write the percent as a fraction out of 100 and then simplify it. Since we know that a percent is always out of 100, we can just write it as a fraction with a denominator of 100. So if we write these percents as fractions, we can write 75%. That means 75 out of 100. So I'm going to write that as a fraction, 75 100ths, and then I can simplify that fraction to 3/4. So 75% as a fraction is 3/4. 30% means 30 out of 100. So I'm going to write that as a fraction, 30 out of 100, and that simplifies to 3/10. 62% means 62 out of 100. So I'm going to write that as a fraction out of 100. And if you simplify that, you get 31/50. 1% means 1 out of 100. So I'm going to write that fraction, 1 out of 100. It's already in simplest form. 5.4%. Now, when you have decimal values in your percents, there's a little bit more involved here. 5.4 out of 100. We have a decimal value in our fraction, which we really don't like to have. So I need to make sure that this becomes a whole number. So I'm going to multiply both of these by 10 to create an equivalent fraction with whole numbers. This is 54 out of 1,000. And now I can simplify that fraction to 27/500ths. And that's my fraction version of 5.4%. Same with this one, 22.5% is 22.5 out of 100. And I need to create an equivalent fraction so that they're whole numbers. So I'm going to multiply both of these by 10. That gives me 225 out of 1,000. And if I simplify that, that's 9/40ths. And there's my fraction of 22.5%. And then lastly, how do I turn a fraction to a percent? So if I have a fraction, how do I know what percent that is? Well, we're going to tap into something we already know, and that's how to turn a fraction into a decimal. So if we turn it into a decimal first, then we'll multiply it by 100. So to write a fraction as a percent, we are going to convert the fraction to a decimal, that's top divided by bottom, remember, and then multiply by 100. So the example here, 9/20ths is 9 divided by 20, which gives me the decimal value of 0.45. And then to convert that decimal to a percent, we take 0.45 times 100, and that's 45%. So 9/20ths is 45%, or 9 out of 20 would be 45%. So to convert these fractions to percents, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take 21 divided by 40, and that gives me 0.525. And then I'm going to multiply that by 100 to get 52.5%. 1/3, 1 divided by 3 will convert this to a decimal, and that's 0.3 repeating. And if I take that times 100, I get 33.3 repeating percent. 3/8 is 3 divided by 8, which gives me 0.375. And I take that times 100, I get 37.5%. Always remembering to put the percent symbol on those when I convert them to percents. 8/12, 8 divided by 12 would convert that to a decimal, which is 0.6 repeating. And if I take that times 100, I get 66.6 repeating percent. 3/4 would be 3 divided by 4, which is 0.75 as a decimal. And then to convert that to a percent, I multiply by 100, and that's 75%. So 3/4 is 75%, or 3 out of 4 is 75%. And then lastly, 17/50 would be 17 divided by 50, and you get 0.34. And if I multiply that by 100, that's 34%. So 17 out of 50 would be 34%. So percents, always making a comparison to 100 and then converting between decimal representations, fraction representations, and percent representations.